In a 2004 interview with the newspaper The Scotsman, J.K. Rowling reflects on the Harry Potter books up until that point. Now, by 2004, the fifth book in the series, The Order of the Phoenix, had just been published. And Rowling had a revelation about her work. Her concept of wizard purity was remarkably similar to the beliefs held by the SS officers who enacted the Holocaust. She had believed she had created the concept of a bigoted party that infiltrates a government and enacts their policy of bloodline superiority all on her own, when in actuality, she had drawn from real life, something that anyone who had any passing knowledge of World War II would know. Now look, I can't even finish that sentence with a straight face. It's absolutely staggering to me that Rowling had no clue that the Death Eaters sounded like real-life bigots. I mean, listen, it's no secret to most who grew up with these books that the author is not the god queen that we all thought she was when we were like 12, but increasingly someone who uses their platform to spread Holocaust denial and conspiracy theories regarding the trans community. This is a sad reality we all have to face, but this video is not really about J.K. Rowling herself. What I actually want to ask here isn't so much the morality of J.K. Rowling, but with all this considered, was Harry Potter even ever good in the first place? This isn't just a question for this video. This is something I genuinely ask myself. Full disclosure, I'm someone who read these books religiously as a kid. I read them book after book. Every time a new one came out, I would be first in line at the midnight release to pick it up. I'm someone who went to a presentation, and this is true, in New York City between J.K. Rowling, Stephen King, and John Irving. They did a joint reading. I haven't even read Cider House Rules yet, and I was going to this thing because J.K. Rowling was there. And because I had just finished Pet Sematary, and in hindsight, that was the better of the books I was reading there. And as a kid, I remember watching this presentation going, wow, John Irving's so good, Stephen King's so good, and J.K. Rowling just lacked a certain something. There were a lot of questions about the craft and writing and all that there, and while Stephen King and John Irving seemed to answer these questions brilliantly, J.K. Rowling always seemed to miss something. I mean, there's even a few surprise guests at this particular hearing. There was Salman Rushdie came in with either his son or grandkid and asked a question. Salman Rushdie, of course, being the controversial author of the Satanic Verses. You can see the writers, when they came in there, they knew their craft inside and out. J.K. Rowling, there was always something absent, something missing. She was upstaged at her own shows.
Yes, there is something I want to ask you.
All right.
How the f*** do you write so many books so fast?
The Harry Potter books played a huge part in my childhood, but even looking back as someone who studied literature for now decades, I don't think these books hold up as well as we think they do. They are not literary masterpieces, they are just books, and books have flaws. All books do. But it's time we evaluate what flaws Harry Potter as a work has, and why this is very interesting from the perspective of someone who grew up with it. Do these flaws ruin the texts? And is it impossible to reconcile the modern day J.K. Rowling with the books we grew up with? You may be shocked to hear this, but I don't think there's much of a difference between what we're seeing now and what we saw back then. The only difference is it's less subtle. In order to be as unbiased as possible here, I'm going to avoid bringing up Rowling's current antics as much as possible. I really want to focus on the works themselves rather than the author that created them. There are many videos about J.K. Rowling I could recommend here. I will link them in the description, but for right now, let's focus on the books. Now, it's important to place Harry Potter in the era in which it was released.
Pikachu!
On an all-new Buffy.
Somebody's been digging up the bodies of dead.
Her grandmother's a witch. Totally. And she lives in Halloween Town, where it's Halloween all the...
In the late 90s, young adult fiction as a genre really didn't have much of a foothold. You had like V.C. Andrews, Goosebumps, Fear Street. You had a lot of romantic teen novels, but that was about it. You didn't see much for teen fantasy at the time. Online fan groups tended to congregate over works such as Buffy the Vampire Slayer or Star Wars, obscure anime, or niche video games. But the literary world didn't really have a big community at the time, outside of arguably Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Riders of Pern series. Even fantasy classics such as A Song of Ice and Fire and The Wheel of Time, even Sword of Truth, didn't really have an online presence outside of niche book communities for adults.
The fourth installment of J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter stories has arrived. It is the single largest phenomenon in publishing history. With 3.8 million books printed in the United States and 3 million more on the way, there has never been a bigger first printing of a book ever.
So Harry Potter came at a time when writing for younger audiences just wasn't really a thing. But Rowling's books changed that. Overnight, they changed it. And by changing it, immediately, the revolution it brought overworked the work itself.
And we're talking about children's books. The series is so successful that the New York Times will create a separate bestseller list for children's fiction to accommodate Harry Potter.
Harry Potter was less important than what Harry Potter represented to publishing as an industry.
There's something unusual going on at Barnes & Noble booksellers at Irving Mall. It's almost midnight and people are still going into the store.
Now, it's no secret that Harry Potter fandom was also rabid during this time, but I think we confuse our experience with the fandom for the merits of the books. And again, fandom was big. This really showed that you can create a community of fans who will market your work for you for free.
Well, I think it comes in two parts. I mean, the first part is the hard part, which is that it is hard to understand why a book, has this kind of following.
The books offered a sense of community for many isolated kids who constantly wanted to be something more than the mundane or bullied. They wanted to be wizards. They wanted their Hogwarts letters. They wanted to be sorted into communities that understood and accepted them. And they wanted to, shoot fire from wands, what have you, or ride broomsticks. That's cool too. This is why so many people imagined existing in the world of Harry Potter, or projected their own personal sensibilities and insecurities into said world. There's a reason why slash fanfiction really took off in the Harry Potter fan community. Young queer fans wanted to project themselves onto the world of Harry Potter. This is why My Immortal became such a beloved meme. It wasn't so much because it was ridiculous, even though it was. It was because it was taking this idea of projecting yourself into a fan work and taking it to the 9th degree, taking it to the umpteenth degree, to the point where the entire work was reshaped. But a lot of fan work kind of did that for Harry Potter consistently. And that's kind of where I think the intriguing element comes in. Why did fans feel the need to bring so much of themselves to this world? Was it potentially to fill an emptiness that they spotted in the world that they were loving?
The second half of the phenomenon is that it is just, at this point, a phenomenon like Pokemon or something that generates its own kind of interest. It's like the kid down the street has it, my sister has it, I want it.
It has that, but it seems to have extended itself beyond a season.
Yes.
In a lot of ways, I compare the early Harry Potter fandom to the early Pokemon fandom. Fervent and intense, sensational, made huge in media, but also because kids and teens could get lost in these worlds rather than any inherent quality to the games and books themselves. There are better RPGs out there, but Pokemon just hit the market at the right time.
In my opinion, parents should not let their kids watch Pokemon, play Pokemon, buy Pokemon cards, have anything whatsoever to do with Pokemon.
However, unlike Pokemon, where fans have this very healthy relationship with the games, they trash talk, but they play them, they love them, but they also hate them. It goes back and forth. Harry Potter was treated as this unassailable great work of literature, and it got kids to read. It contained these great, rich ideas. Why wouldn't they love them? How could you ever criticize this? But they were critics. Many of them, actually.
One cannot be happy about the 35 million copies of Harry Potter. I had a piece in today's Wall Street Journal.
I saw the editorial, yes, about that piece.
Yes,
We can't be happy about that?
No, I think that's not reading, because there's nothing there to be read. They're just an endless string of cliches. I cannot think that does anyone any good. I mean, people tell me, well, at least the child is reading, to which my answer is no, the child isn't reading. That's not The Wind in the Willows. That's not Through the Looking Glass. That's not Charlotte's Web by E.B. White or James Thurber's The 13 Clocks. That's not really children's literature. It's really just slop.
One of the more famous ones was literary critic Harold Bloom, who hated Harry Potter. But Harold Bloom's criticisms were easy to dismiss at the time because Bloom himself was not a figure of spotless reputation, and he compared Harry Potter to the works he was focusing on: Shakespeare, Chaucer, Dante. Of course, Harry Potter won't compare to the greats. It's fantasy literature for teenagers. It's not going to be, the greatest piece of literature ever made. And fans dismissed him, and many others like him. But I think a few things happened in the immediate aftermath of Harry Potter that really forced us to reevaluate the works. Now, for one, the big thing is the young adult market exploded in popularity. One of the authors that really were catapulted into the mainstream was Rick Riordan, a middle grade writer who created the series Percy Jackson.
Well, if kids find my stories interesting, I hope it's because I was a teacher for a long time and I kind of know what kids like. I always imagine myself telling these stories to my own classroom, sort of fifth period after lunch, when it's really hard to get their attention. I also have a built-in advantage because I talk about mythology, and I think mythology is something that kids really can relate to. I know that when I was a kid, I loved it. My own sons just ate it up, and whenever I taught it for the schools, it was always the kids' favorite thing. It's just, mythology has everything you would want for a good story. It's got romance, action, mystery, murder, villains, heroes, monsters. What more could you want?
And Percy Jackson, I think, is a great foil to Harry Potter. One I'd argue is really what Harry Potter could have been if written by a stronger writer who cared more about their readers. Riordan wrote Percy Jackson to give his son, who struggled with dyslexia, a hero he could relate to on an intimate level.
I decided to make Percy Jackson ADHD and dyslexic because my own son is ADHD dyslexic, and he was having a lot of trouble when he was young. I decided that Percy should be like him, an ADHD dyslexic kid, having his own trouble, but I made it a sign of honor. If you had those conditions, there was a good chance you were a demigod. And my son had no trouble believing that.
And that motivation impacted the series from book to book. Whenever Riordan realized a demographic of child had begun to identify with his stories, he added representation so they felt included directly. This included racial diversity, neurodivergency, LGBTQ sexualities, gender identity, religious background. It's all there across Riordan's sprawling universe.
Now, I'm not going to say that Rick Riordan is a flawless person either. Far from it. He's made mistakes and made some statements that are less than wonderful. But he did do a lot over the course of his work to help kids identify with his world. There's a reason why Percy Jackson, despite an unsuccessful adaptation in the late 2000s, has remained beloved. It's remained in discussion purely as a work of literature. Even now, what, like 15, 20 years later?
This is why those inspired by Harry Potter differ from those inspired by, say, the Hunger Games. A lot of Hunger Games knockoffs were dystopians, yes, and they captured the style of the original work, but they lacked that thoughtful world building. I don't want to call out specific books, but I am thinking of Divergent here. A book like Divergent just doesn't have the same strong world building as the Hunger Games. Whereas the Hunger Games feels real, Divergent is clearly a fantasy, and you can tell the moment you start evaluating how these worlds function.
And they divided us into 5 groups, factions, to keep the peace.
Compare any millennial fantasy writer's writing with Harry Potter. A good example is Leigh Bardugo with the Grishaverse to Rowling's Potterverse, and you see a world that's very much informed by reality and heavily structured as such.
A reader or a listener, when they're entering your world, are going to need 2 things to orient themselves: sense of power, sense of place. So when we think about the way that power operates in a fictional world, our mind instantly goes to the big picture stuff, right? Rules of a magic system, the government that's in control. But the truth is that power exists in macrocosm and in microcosm. And you need to think about which elements of power are impacting your character the most as they move through the day, through their family, through their friend group, maybe through their professional space. That's power.
The world building's meticulous in Bardugo's universe, but in turn, it's also harder to project yourself into that world. The Grishaverse isn't a place you want to live in, like you want to live in Hogwarts. There's a very different vibe. In fact, you're kind of grateful you're not living in Bardugo's universe.
So the question that inspired Shadow and Bone was, what if darkness was a place? What if the monsters you imagined there were real? What if you had to fight them on their own territory?
And that's the brilliance of Harry Potter. You could project yourself into that world. And it's also why so many fans now are rejecting the series. This place that invited them in turns out to be not so inviting after all. But the question becomes, was Harry Potter ever actually inviting to begin with? I would say no. It's no secret among former fans that Rowling continuously retconned her work to include entire demographics she just never thought to include previously. Dumbledore being gay is an example of this, but they're also the examples of Jewish wizards. They were hindsight for Rowling. The Patel twins are the only real people of color Harry Potter encounters in most of the books until the introduction of Kingsley Shacklebolt. And I don't know about you, but naming the only character who's clearly black in your work after Shackles seems a bit tone-deaf, Joanne.
Well, you may not like him, Minister, but you can't deny Dumbledore's got style.
When you look at Harry Potter with a critical eye, you see an incredibly traditional world, right? One where the systems of power are always upheld. Even when the Ministry of Magic is overtaken by the Death Eaters in Umbridge, even when Hogwarts is overtaken by Death Eaters as well, and Voldemort, the system is good in the world of Harry Potter. The system does not need to change. There's no flaws in the system. It's just, we gotta pluck out the bad eggs, and everything will right itself in the end. You see a world where heteronormativity is the norm and deviation from it is criticized. Rowling outright stated that the lycanthropy in Harry Potter, werewolfism, is in her world a reference, or at least inspired in part, by the AIDS epidemic. And it seems odd to me that the community through which this infliction permeates, the werewolves, led by Fenrir Greyback, preys on children and infects them with their illness. Much like how Rowling now thinks that the queer community preys and grooms children. It's not surprising that this theme is present in the works themselves. She's always believed some version of it. We just don't see this until we look back at the works in hindsight, see these tropes, see these trends for what they actually are.
And then there's the beauty thing. A lot of works use beauty as shorthand for goodness. This is a common trope, but what often comes also is that bad people are described as ugly, and nowhere is this more evident than in Harry Potter.
I must be the one to kill Harry Potter.
I mean, obviously, Voldemort is a weird snake person, but a big shorthand in the books for evilness is body mass, fatness. How many pages upon pages of this book is spent describing how fat Dudley is?
Dudley is described as having a fat head, fat wrists, fat arms, and fat legs. We are also treated to multiple mentions of Dudley having a big fat butt, because that's certainly an appropriate way for an adult to describe a fictional child.
Now, Mrs. Weasley is called plump a couple times, but Dudley is relentlessly mocked by the narration and other characters for his weight and the universe at large. In fact, it's only when he loses weight that he starts to become a better person morally. His weight loss is tied with a turn in his character arc, which is very unpleasant and has implications that are very awful. In the world of Harry Potter, the only characters who are described as fat are bad guys.
We also get other characters who have fat thumbs, fat fingers, fat cheeks. Lord, let this be on their faces. Or as an immensely fat, melting, iced cake.
For a work that apparently invited audiences into their world, this deliberate bullying serves only to show that certain people aren't welcome in this world. It tells people that if you're not thin, you are not welcomed. You will be bullied and dehumanized.
Fat people never just do things in the Harry Potter books. Fat people don't walk anywhere. They waddle, or lumber, or have a heavy tread. Fat people fat their way down the street fatly, while fatting around. And if you think I'm kidding, there's a description of Dolores Umbridge where she literally turns squatly.
And when it comes to Asian characters, why don't we ask Joanne what country Cho Chang comes from? Is that a Korean surname? Chinese? Vietnamese? What country is that from, Joanne?
The first sentence of that book is, there once was a Chinese boy named Tiki Tiki Tembo, no saw Rembo, Cherry Berry Ruchi Pipberry Pembo. No, there wasn't.
Hogwarts is a world where the status quo, even when tested, is God. When the Ministry of Magic and Hogwarts itself are compromised by the villainous Death Eaters, the resolution is to restore these systems to the way they were before, regardless of how corrupt they were before. We see corrupt politicians in the world of Harry Potter very overtly, and Rowling says, they're alright. Go back to that system. This is even considering that Hogwarts itself is built in with evil, built into its foundation. The evil house of Slytherin, the Chamber of Secrets, buried under its intestines, under the very piping and plumbing of the school.
You all know, of course, that Hogwarts was founded over 1,000 years ago by the 4 greatest witches and wizards of the age. Now, 3 of the founders coexisted quite harmoniously. 1 did not.
There is no nuance with Slytherin, by the way. That is, a lot of fans added nuance, trying to find good Slytherins. The Cursed Child tries to build some nuance to it. But in Harry Potter, the work, until the very end of the series, if you're in Slytherin, you're evil. And why are you in Slytherin? Ambition. Vanity.
Salazar Slytherin wished to be more selective about the students admitted to Hogwarts. He believed magical learning should be kept within all magic families. In other words, purebloods.
There's not a witch or wizard who went bad who wasn't in Slytherin.
So right now, I'm going to talk about a couple different characters who I think would qualify for Slytherin House, and if Rowling had written them, they'd be considered evil or something. And one character who would qualify for Slytherin House and probably be deemed as evil by Rowling, freaking Yuri Katsuki from Yuri on Ice.
僕の名前は勝木優里。どこにでもいる日本のフィギュアスケート特別強化選手で23歳。強そうな名前だけど、初グランプリファイナルで最下位。現実がまだ受け止めきれないよ。
Yeah, I bet you didn't expect a Yuri on Ice reference in this video, but Ice Adolescence was just canceled as I'm recording this, and I'm still pissed about that. Mappa, sell the rights to Yuri on Ice, you sons of... Yuri's main trait is ambition. He is trying to be number one, but his insecurities are also his biggest issues. So while he's ambitious, he's also very anxious. He's very self-defeating. Both his strength and his weakness comes from his drive to be the best and to make Victor notice him. So, you know, that would put him in Slytherin House. That would put him in a house where every single person is deemed basically another Death Eater waiting to happen. And let's not even get started on how Yuri defies gender norms all the time. He dresses in a feminine fashion. He falls in love with both men and women. So Rowling would probably hate him, and that's not even getting into Yuri's struggles with weight. I have a feeling that Rowling would be even more fatphobic to this character than Mappa was, which itself is one of the bigger criticisms of an otherwise very charming BL anime that deserves more. And Mappa, if you're just going to sit on those rights, sell them to someone who could actually do something with it. For that matter, I also wanted to go back to the Grishaverse for a second and talk about one particular character from the book Six of Crows.
So the question that inspired Shadow and Bone was, what if darkness was a place? What if the monsters you imagined there were real? What if you had to fight them on their own territory?
Now, I'd say about 5 of the 6 crows would probably count for Slytherin House for one reason or another, but in particular, I want to highlight Nina.
Nina's a radical. Thinks Grisha should get to choose if they serve the crown. She despises involuntary service more than she does Fjördens.
I won't go into super depth with her character because she is incredibly fascinating and I think undergoes a lot of very interesting changes over the course of these books. But we have a character who, if she existed in Harry Potter, would be framed as evil from the get-go. She's a child soldier, a sex worker, plump, flaunts her sexuality, and is also very bisexual.
There's a pub downstairs that serves hot meals. Maybe they have waffle.
What are waffles?
I can't wait to introduce you to my truest love.
And that's not even getting into a complicated relationship with someone who grew up in a fascist ethno state, or all the horrible nonsense she goes through in the second book, Crooked Kingdom, thanks to, well, if you've read the end of Six of Crows, you know what I'm referring to, and I won't spoil that here.
But again, to my point, Nina and Yuri, if in Harry Potter, would absolutely be in Slytherin and absolutely be someone Rowling demonized. But because both Nina and Yuri were written by authors who liked the characters, who liked writing flawed characters, we see that they have dimension. They're not all good or all evil. I wouldn't even call anything Yuri does particularly bad either. They're both flawed characters with personal problems they have to overcome. And that's it. They're like anyone else because they were written by talented writers. But when you look at Harry Potter and his friends, they go through the ringer and ultimately become dogs of the military, enforcing the status quo without ever implementing any real changes. I don't think I need to go into detail of the strange subplot regarding the house elves and Hermione, where Hermione sees an injustice in society, tries to change it, and she's laughed at. And when she's laughed at, none of the main characters ever actually question the status quo in any meaningful, direct fashion ever again. Sure, they fight the Death Eaters, they fight the bad actors, but they never confront the systems of authority that govern their world. They just go along with it. Even Harry, when presented with the fact that he has to die to stop Voldemort, he goes along with it. He doesn't question it, because that's how it needs to be.
But beyond the morality of the Potterverse, this universe just doesn't make any sense if you think about it for a few minutes. Again, time turners. These things could destroy an entire world in a sense. You can go back and just stop Voldemort from ever hurting Harry's parents. You can stop him from being conceived if you really wanted to. But rather than grapple with these implications and how the world could change dramatically, Rowling, when she realizes they're a plot hole, just removes them from the plot, out of convenience. In fact, it's this particular plot hole that leads to the events of the Cursed Child. I can't say that play was good, but at least it grappled with the obvious implications of time turners. Another thing, how does magic function in Harry Potter? I don't think we need a Brandon Sanderson level magic system here, but something to explain the limits of magic would be deeply appreciated. Despite taking place at a magic school, we never understand the limits of magic. We are told certain witches and wizards are powerful, yes, but how are they powerful? What does that even mean when there's a spell that anyone can learn that just stops someone's heart? I'm of the opinion that the more limitations you put on magic, the more compelling it becomes. Fullmetal Alchemist, Avatar: The Last Airbender, very simple magic systems with very simple rules that were concrete and enforced. And that makes things incredibly interesting. And both were contemporaries of Harry Potter. You'd think a story that spends so much time at magic school would take the time to explain how magic works. But apparently, if you just say the spell right and flick your wand a certain way, you could just do any spell, apparently. And yes, we do see wizards training for certain magic, but we don't understand why these spells are harder than others. It's just never elaborated on beyond this spell is hard to do. What does that mean? How do you quantify hard to do?
What's remarkable, though, is that there is another far older fantasy series where magic is based in language. One that explores the limits of magic more effectively and takes place partially at a magical school. And is all just the better for it.
I had written a couple of short stories that took place on these islands where there were wizards and dragons.
Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea saga started in the mid-60s after Le Guin noticed there was a distinct lack of people of color in fantasy. She sought to fix that with her profound story.
As a boy, our hero was called Sparrowhawk because the wild hawks would come when he called them. But his true secret name is Ged.
Ged, also known as Sparrowhawk, is a boy who trains to become a wizard, learns the impact of unchecked power, and spends his life going on adventures to righten the balance of existence itself.
This was not, at that time, a well-known concept, idea of a wizard school.
Magic in Earthsea is interesting, because it is a language. If you speak the true name of something, you can command it. But while on paper it seems pretty straightforward, you just read the word, you figure out how to say it, and that's it. There's a catch to every spell. You are in command of that element, and if you do not know how to properly handle it, things in nature will go out of control. Power is not an issue. Control is the issue. The strength of a wizard is based on their knowledge, yes, but knowledge brings with it an extra consequence. If you know what your spell can do, you know then what the spell can also do. And so you're more likely to do less, even as you become more powerful. Very specifically, illusion is focused on in the books as the sort of common magic that Ged gets frustrated with at first because, he's not making anything real, he's making illusions of something. But when he deals with the real and tangible, when he conjures a spirit, it results in death. Someone dies, and it follows him for the whole first book. The consequences of his actions are the antagonist of the book, and other witches who conjure magic without thinking end up being penalized for their carelessness, usually in ways that hurt themselves and others.
You might say, he who would be sea master must know the true name of every drop of water in the sea.
It's a very, very self-conscious, very reflective system of magic that I think is brilliant and I think is done not often enough. In terms of my own writing, I've reflected on Earthsea's magic system a ton. That magic itself can be all-powerful, but if you lose control, if you lose focus even once, that can be it for you. In particular, when Earthsea deals with death. I want to compare for a moment Voldemort, the main antagonist of Harry Potter, to Cobb, one of the main antagonists in the Earthsea series, specifically the third book. For Miyazaki fans, this is the one that was in the Ghibli film. Voldemort obviously wants to conquer death, seeing how his Horcruxes are a means to remain immortal forever, but his pursuit of immortality only impacts him. It only deforms him. It is an extension of his true villainy, yes, but he's not a villain because he wants to live forever. Nicholas Flamel wants to live forever. He's a villain because he wants to hurt others. He is a bigot. He is a fascist. His monstrous transformation is an externalization of his inner evil, but his pursuit of immortality only affects him personally. Cobb, though, he's different. Cobb wants to stop death from happening, period. And he puts a stop to death very effectively. But in doing so, he throws off the natural order. We see disarray and discords surge throughout all of Earthsea. Things go wrong everywhere. We only see Cobb at the end of the third book. And even then, he's shown more as the center of this magical storm than an actual figure of malice. In fact, he's more tragic than anything else. He's sad. He's dominated by his fear of the inevitable and tries to change nature to avoid it. But his pursuit for life ultimately causes widespread disaster, and he doesn't care, and so he needs to be stopped. Repairing reality is what costs Ged more than anything else. Cobb is almost a secondary concern to the ramification of Cobb's actions.
Now, for Harry Potter, he just tracks down the Horcruxes, beats Voldemort, and that fixes everything. There's no lingering damage. Stopping one bad guy fixes the world. No personal long-term cost to Harry, beyond others losing their lives. Even Edward Elric loses more when stopping Father. The cast of Six of Crows in the Grishaverse loses everything multiple times over. Ged, of course, sacrifices so much. Frodo, beyond losing a finger, is ostracized, self-ostracized really, because the trauma he experienced can't allow him to reintegrate with society. But Harry doesn't lose anything. Sure, he's killed, but he gets better very quickly. It's a temporary setback. Even beyond Harry, in Harry Potter, characters die and the world just moves on. So long as the status quo is fixed, no one seems to mourn all that much. Bad deeds can be overlooked because someone did one good thing in death. It's a disturbing world of moral extremes. Either everyone is all good, or they're all evil.
And I think ultimately, that's my big issue with Harry Potter. Sure, I could argue that Harry Potter ripped off Earthsea, incorporating its magic school or language-based magic system into the world, but that would give Rowling too much credit. I don't think she read Earthsea. And again, this is obvious, the Harry Potter books are a reference to the boarding school stories that Rowling read as a kid, with magic sprinkled into it. And because she doesn't understand how fantasy world building works all that well, that's where the flaws come in.
I don't think Harry Potter could have existed without Earthsea having existed. That was the original, the finest, and the best.
And it's not a Books of Magic ripoff either, as Neil Gaiman has pointed out, even though the worlds and character are very similar in Books of Magic, but Rowling just drew from imagery that was around her life. She drew from the imperial British iconography that she grew up with. And Harry Potter is indeed a very British story, but that's ultimately its problem. It is a British story, and in being so British, it incorporates a lot of the British imperialistic mindset into its work. The pro-monarchy, pro-Thatcher ideas of the 80s. You see that all over.
Please believe us.
I do, Miss Granger, but I'm sorry to say the word of 3 13-year-old wizards will convince few others.
But there's got to be good to this work, right? There has to be something that works, right? Why do people like these books at all? You know, why? My thoughts? It's only because the world existed in a way where a kid could imagine themselves living in it. It's not that the world is well written, it's that the world is beautiful. And kids needed that at the time. We had no other outlet. We had Pokemon, sure. We had some cartoons, but we didn't have a book that was so immersive like this, that seemed to be about something, that grew with its audience. It did a lot of things right, but in the ways it failed, I think that failed its audience even more.
I'm really excited because I read the 3 books in like 2 days, and I really am looking forward to reading the 4th one. I was waiting for it to come out, so I'm really excited.
As I get older and read more fantasy, the Harry Potter books become less remarkable to me. Even ignoring the real-life implications of these works, the world just feels stale. The characters feel stale. They never change, nothing grows. Even ignoring the maps of school, which, by the way, Joanne, why did you draw the school districts like this? Why is Pakistan and India going to the same school district? Why is Africa going to one school? What colonialist nonsense is this? And even ignoring Rowling's retcons. Like, Joanne, why did you say that wizards can just poop on the floor and the magic just gets rid of the poop? Like, the toilets in Hogwarts, the Chamber of Secrets was built into a toilet. And even then, do you think that's what people in medieval Europe did, or Rome, or any region outside of Europe? Do you think they just dropped their pants and just... Is that what you think people use? We have history books on this. No one ever wanted to walk around in fecal matter. What are you talking about?
Looks like I picked the wrong week to quit sniffing glue.
And that's the other issue. The Potterverse is so incredibly British, it fails to understand that a world exists outside of Britain. When you really think about it, Voldemort, what does he really threaten? He threatens the island of Britain, right? He's not a threat outside of that. But because they frame the wizarding world as the UK, the Ministry of Magic Prime Minister meets with the UK Prime Minister, and no other world leaders? I mean, that's canon. So, where is the world's extension? He's a threat to Britain, but in America, were we threatened by Voldemort? Do we have stronger wizards here? It's never really elaborated on until Fantastic Beasts. And what's strange is that we exist in a magic school. We should be learning the boundaries of the magical world, and yet we're not. It's simply illogical to assume that every culture sees magic and wizardry the same way, right down to how they want to keep the secret of wizardry from muggles. Well, does every culture really want to do that? Again, going back to Earthsea, the world is divided into several islands. Each island has its own culture and its own relationship with magic, and what one island sees as a god there, to an outsider, like Ged, this god's an eldritch abomination that feeds on human misery. But you can't question the world in Harry Potter. No, don't ask why house elves have to serve. Don't ask why goblins or centaurs are treated as second-class citizens. Don't ask why Rowling thought... okay, so I won't say the name of this particular entity in Native American folklore, but out of respect for the Native people, because they believe that if you say the name of this thing, it will conjure it, and I want to be respectful of their culture. Even if I don't believe that that's the case, respectfulness. But rest assured, this entity is a witch who breaks the laws of nature for selfish intent by physically transforming themselves into an animal. It's a creature so feared, again, saying its name is meant to conjure them. And Rowling took that, this very sacred, very disturbing, very taboo idea, and commodified it in her world. They're just witches who just being persecuted by those silly Native Americans that the British persecuted for centuries. Can't respect their beliefs. No, it has to be framed within the British Empire's perspective. It's that everyone else is wrong, but Britain is right. And this is why the boundaries of the schools in Harry Potter are so strange outside of Hogwarts. You have like 5 or 6 in Europe, and then you have big swatches of every other continent. Billions of people under one school roof. What does that say? So of course her world building is ethnocentric. It's imperialism. It's British imperialism. It's British superiority without any questioning of that system. Now I know I have friends from England. I studied in England. I know I have English viewers, and I know you aren't like this. But she is. That's the difference. When I say I'm talking about the pro-monarchy, pro-Thatcher-esque beliefs that Rowling clearly embodies. And this is the kind of mindset that led to Brexit. While the youths were revolting, the adults carelessly passed laws and put their youths in a very dangerous position. It's that mentality all the way through. I'm right, you're wrong. I know it's best for everyone else, and if you disagree with me, you're foolish. That is the mindset J.K. Rowling embodies in her work and in her real life. And that's why Harry Potter fails as a work when you scrutinize it, because she clearly doesn't know everything that she's trying to talk about. And there are gaps in her viewpoint, and there are gaps in her understanding of the world that when you poke at it, become transparent. And when they become transparent, she patches them up quickly. Time turners can cause problems. Oh, time turners are gone. What's Hogwarts? What's the Wizarding World like outside Britain? Big map that is an oversimplification of things. It's only told from my perspective. Why are there no gay wizards? Well, Dumbledore is gay. You never saw it because I didn't think of it at the time. Give you more money now. Universal deal. New HBO Max miniseries adaptation.
But there has to be something good, right? The characters, maybe. That's what people fell in love with in the first place. Like Tonks. She defies the laws of nature. She's a person with blue hair and pronouns who can shapeshift her face, who gradually settles down and stops changing her appearance constantly when she meets the right man. A man who's an allegory for gay men struggling with AIDS. Hang on, that doesn't sound right. That's not correct. A Dumbledore. There we go. A guy who had a gay fascist phase when he was younger, who is just always right, despite endangering the lives of countless children, and grooms multiple children to be his personal pawns in a greater scheme against an evil wizard, one he helped train and raise in the first place. Wait, no, hang on. That's not right either. I'm sorry. Who else is there? Hermione, Ron. Harry Potter, the main character of these books, right? He's the central figure. So, when he learned he was bullied for years by his family, and he learned he was secretly rich and powerful and the chosen one, and he becomes a cop, enforcing the very system that enforced fascist beliefs. Okay, no, wait, hang on, I'm mistaken. This can't be how it is. But it is.
Unlike Hermione, Harry never returned to Hogwarts to finish his newts, but he did dive right into his career as an Auror at the Ministry of Magic. As it turns out, Harry was able to achieve the honor of head Auror at the ripe age of 26.
The ending of Harry Potter honestly ruins the entire series because nothing changes. Nothing has changed. The world isn't changed by all this tragedy. No one really grows. You end up in a variant of where you started off. Every character. Harry Potter starts the series with wonder and respect for magic and a love of the Wizarding World, and he ends that way. Hermione starts as a brilliant know-it-all who's the top in her class, and she ends it that way. All the side characters, they barely change at all. Except again for Draco Malfoy, and that's why he's a fan favorite, but even then, most of his change happens at the very end and becomes more like the protagonist who he once bullied. But despite all the ups and downs along the way, when you compare point start to point end, almost everyone is in a very similar position as to when they start the first book, except for Voldemort, who's dead. But again, that's kind of the starting point for him too. And the flaws that developed over the course of the story, like Ron's jealousy over Harry or Draco's bigotry, they rise, they come into play, and then they fall away a bit. They kind of go away. They are conveniently forgotten about after they are resolved. There's no lasting ramifications, it just ends. Aside from how these characters get married and get older, how do they change? How's Hagrid change? Does Snape really grow in any way throughout these books, or is he just a bully at the start, a bully at the end, who did a couple of nice things in between those 2 points because he had a crush on a girl he met when he was a kid, who he harbored a crush for into his later adulthood? Like, no one changes. It's the same motivation when you're a newborn kid to when you're an adult. No variation, nothing. Unless you die, in which case you're removed from the story. Case in point, Tonks and Lupin.
When other fantasy works end, it's sometimes painful. Lord of the Rings shows that even after war ends, you can never go back to the way things were. That trauma sticks with you. Narnia ends with the ultimate release from life. Ged spends a lifetime doing everything he can until he can no longer do anything else. I compared Harry Potter to Pokemon at the start of this video, but even each Pokemon game ends with you undertaking this journey and accomplishing something through hard work, strategy, and travel. And the world does change. You are the champion. The hierarchy is upset. But this, once one bad guy is beaten, life goes back to the way it was. Trauma has no lingering effect. There's no changes made to the system that was compromised by evil. Things just go on. It's so shallow and stagnant. No one actually learns anything except that the bad guy was bad, which we knew from the start. It's so poorly thought out, and it's so disappointing. And knowing that there's nothing to it, that this was no allegory for some greater idea, shows that it's not even like a reflection of real life. This was just all she could think of. And that's kind of sad, honestly.
Because there's nothing there to be read. They're just an endless string of cliches. I cannot think that that does anyone any good. I mean, people tell me, well, at least the child is reading, to which my answer is no, the child isn't reading.
I think we brought so much of ourselves into these books that we didn't realize there's nothing here for us. Especially when we grew out of them. And even then, at the time the books ended, a lot of people hated that last chapter. It was widely criticized. Entire fan fictions were written to ignore that last chapter. They absolutely despised it, but they convinced themselves that the books, other than that last bit, were still good. There was still charm to them. And I say you were wrong. That ending completely ruins everything that came before it. The charm wears off the moment you take off your nostalgia glasses. And you're left with something kind of miserable.
Knowing what the works have become today, how bad actors use nostalgia to manipulate others into siding with bigoted causes, the works are sullied on a level not unlike Ender's Game for me. It's hard to justify contributing to that machine without also knowing what causes you're financing with your purchases. It just fucking sucks, man. It feels like a divorce in some ways from something that meant a lot to us as kids, but you also know you need to get rid of for your own sake. It's painful but necessary to reflect that these stories just aren't all that good. And yes, a boycott isn't going to solve anything. I mean, there's always going to be people who buy this product. Your contributions won't have a big impact on the greater whole, but it's more your personal needs. You need art that makes you feel and experience life as it should be, not stagnation, not cycling through what ultimately is a wish fulfillment fantasy that isn't all that much of a fantasy. And while we may slip a few quotes from these works into our daily language, perhaps without even realizing it, it's time we really consider our relationship to this text, especially given what Rowling says and does with her money nowadays. Now, I do want to mention Hogwarts Legacy a little bit. The game was highly controversial for numerous reasons, but one thing that strikes me a year later is just how no one talks about this game. It's so boring. They talk about the controversy, sure, but who talks about the game itself? You have a few spells, barely a fraction of what the first Final Fantasy game for the NES provided, and even less of a fraction than what Game of the Year Baldur's Gate 3 had. The world feels empty. You can walk around Hogwarts riding your broomstick, but you can finish the game in 10 hours, less even. And there's very little drive to complete the rest of the game because there's very little reward for it. Once you beat it, that's kind of it. It's just window dressing of a magical world without anything else to see. And I feel it's emblematic of Harry Potter as a whole. It's a visual and audio aesthetic that's powerful, but once you dig deeper, all you find is emptiness. And you leave feeling profoundly unfulfilled.
I guess what I'm saying is, just read another book. Read Percy Jackson, read Six of Crows, read the Books of Magic, read Earthsea, read The Golden Compass, read Narnia, Lord of the Rings, Dune, Song of Ice and Fire, read N.K. Jemisin, read The Dragon Riders of Pern, read Silence of the Lambs, read Stephen King, John Irving, John Grisham, read Clive Barker, read the Wheel of Time. Read, what's another book I can think of off the top of my head? Looking at the shelves here. Shakespeare, Poe, Dante Alighieri, John Milton. Read Sherlock Holmes. Read Jane Austen. Read Elizabeth. Read the Bronte sisters. Read the Shadowhunter books. Okay, actually, don't read those. Those aren't that good. But you don't have to read Harry Potter anymore. There's just nothing there for you in these books. The magic happened. And the magic is gone. And once you step outside of Hogwarts, you realize how empty that world is.
My name's Harry Potter Jr. I just moved into this building.